So tonight's lecture is also part of the University of York's commitment to Athena Swan. The Athena Swan Charter recognises the advancement of gender equality, representation, progression and success for all. This academic year saw the launch of the university's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion strategy, which sets out a vision and commitment to create a working, learning, social and living environment that will enable all staff and students to play an integral part in the York community, where everyone can participate and contribute to university life, knowledge and growth. Established in 2005, the Athena Swan Charter recognises the advancement of gender equality in the higher education sector in the UK. In 2015, the Charter was expanded beyond the STEM subjects, science, engineering, and technology and maths, to include all disciplines and to include professional staff working in academic departments. The University of York has a really strong track record of engaging with the Athena Swan Charter at both institutional and departmental level, and was the first Yorkshire university to win an Athena Swan Bronze Award in recognition of its success in providing positive support for women during their careers. 12 of our 27 academic departments currently hold an Athena Swan Award, and a further 4 departments are awaiting results of new submissions. Our departments of chemistry and biology hold the highest accolade of a gold award, while the Hull York Medical School and the departments of psychology and physics also hold silver awards. The activities required to achieve Athena Swan Awards are closely aligned to other current key university activities, including extensive work on addressing the gender pay gap, a very live issue in the university, nationally and indeed internationally. York's ambition to be a sector leader in equality and inclusion, and the development of the new University Equality, Diversity and Inclusion strategy, as well as continued engagement with the Athena Swan Charter, provides an exciting focus and vision for the future. In this overall context then, it's a great honour and privilege to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Professor Joan C Williams. Described as having something approaching rock star status, not my quote, but someone else's, in fact the New York Times Magazine, Professor Williams has played a central role in reshaping the conversation about work, gender and class over the past quarter century. She is a distinguished Professor of Law, Hastings Foundation Chair, and Founding Director of the Centre for Work-Life Law at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. Her path-breaking work helped to create the field of work-family studies and modern workplace flexibility policies. Joan is the author of What Works for Women at Work, co-written with her daughter, Rachel Dempsey, and most recently co-authored a workbook companion to that volume. She is also the founder of Gender Bias Bingo, a web-based project aimed at providing information and tools on gender bias to professors. I think we definitely need to get sight of that here at the University of York, Joan, and I hope you're going to give us the link later. Joan has explored the parallels and differences between gender and racial bias in 2 influential reports. The first, Double Jeopardy, Gender Bias Against Women in Science, has been shared over 40,000 times in the media. And the second, Climate Control, Gender and Racial Bias in Engineering, was co-authored by the Society for Women Engineers and surveyed the opinions of over 3,000 engineers in its production. Joan has won many awards, including the Families and Work Institute's Work-Life Legacy Award in 2014, the American Bar Foundation's Outstanding Scholar Award in 2012, the ABA's Margaret Brent Women Award for Lawyers of Achievement in 2006, and the Distinguished Publication Award of the Association for Women in Psychology in 2004. A very prestigious record. So Joan, we're delighted to welcome you to York this evening, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us. So can I please invite you to give your talk entitled, What Works for Women at Work? 4 Patterns Working Women Need to Know. Joan Williams.
strategies that women can use to navigate through subtle patterns of gender bias that are still with us. This stems from a book that I began now about 5 years ago, when I actually was kind of fed up to here, and I thought, nothing is changing, so whatever. I will just show women how to deal with what's out there. And then, because of the response to the book, we just finished recently a workbook that gives people step-by-step ways to, for example, build your professional network, or figure out a strategy for self-promotion that you might actually feel personally comfortable with. So I'll be talking a little bit about both of those things. We all have our dark nights of the soul, and like most of them, this passed for me. So having given up on organizational change, we've now gone back to organizational change. And what we have done is taken the same social psychology I used for the initial research and forged it into a set of open source tools available online at that website that organizations can use to interrupt bias based on race, gender, social class origin, disability, and other kinds of social disadvantage. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. So when I began this project, I'd been reading social psychology studies for, probably 15 years. And they weren't changing. They just kept redocumenting the same patterns over and over again. But there was a big controversy in American courts about whether this information was admissible in court, because these were social psychology lab studies where you invite students into a lab, for example, very often, then you give them identical resumes and ask them whom they would hire. And so people were saying, well, that happens in the lab, but there's no evidence that it actually happens in the world. So I thought, well, we'll see. Does it happen in the world? And so I wanted to find that out, but also I wanted to find out what successful women had done to navigate through these patterns of bias. And that's what works for women at work. The way I did the research was that every time I met a really savvy woman for about a 2-year period, I said, can I have 45 minutes of your time? And then the protocol was really simple. I simply recited to her the findings of experimental social psychology. I called it 40 years of research in 7 minutes. And then I asked a very simple question. Any of that sound familiar? One woman said, you just described my life, which somebody actually said to me just today again. One woman just burst into tears. So I did 127 interviews, and I was a little shocked to find that 96% of the women reported encountering one or more of these 4 patterns of bias. This had also been the first time that people had really explored how common each pattern was, because there are 4 quite distinct patterns, which people really hadn't pointed out before. And as you see from the bubbles on the bottom, how common the patterns are is quite different, pattern by pattern. So we'll talk about that too. And so based on this social psychology, the Center for Work-Life Law, which I run, now really has developed 3 quite different sets of tools. I'll be focusing tonight on individual strategies that women can use themselves, and saying a little bit about what I call individual bias interrupters. That's the way that anybody can interrupt bias on behalf of yourself or others, just in your daily travels, without spending too much political capital. And then I'll say also a little bit about the organizational bias interrupters, those open source toolkits, because the real answer, if an organization has a diversity problem, a woman's initiative is fine, but it's actually only responsive if the problem is with the women. And the problem is typically not with the women. The problem typically is if you have a diversity problem, it's because these 4 patterns are constantly being transmitted through basic business systems, through hiring, through evaluations, through meetings, and through assignments. And those are the open source toolkits that are available online. So you can take those systems that you already have in place and just, in an evidence-based way, introduce slight tweaks that will interrupt the bias from being transmitted. The first pattern I call prove it again. And as you can see, about 2/3 of women report it. That's a robust number. It's now being shown in a variety of data sets. About 1/3 of men, if you ask, will say, I have to prove myself more than my colleagues. But about 2/3 of women and about 2/3 of people of color say yes. So there's a lot of evidence going back decades that women need to provide more evidence of competence than men to be judged equally competent. They have to prove themselves over and over again. Here's an example. This is actually from a woman in Silicon Valley. She said, they said they needed more time to make sure that I was a good fit for the new job, despite the fact that I had actually already been doing it for over a year. So in effect, I got a promotion without a change in title or salary. That's a very common pattern in Silicon Valley. And you notice how she has to prove herself over and over again. This stems in part from lack of fit. The picture is of Ben Bars, who unfortunately passed this year. Ben was a trans man and a very famous neuroscientist. And he said, shortly after I changed sex, a faculty member was heard to say, Ben Bars gave a great seminar today, but then his work is so much better than his sister's. That is a very pure example of cognitive bias, right? It was literally the same work. But once he became Ben rather than Barbara, it seemed better. Another element, another mechanism that produces prove it again stems from what's called in-group favoritism. Every group, well, actually it's a little more complicated. High status groups tend to prefer members of their own group. This is very important in terms of determining social networks, and social networks are extraordinarily important in professional careers. 70 to 95% of professionals get jobs through what's called the strength of weak ties, broad networks of acquaintances. What do you think, raise your hand, is the most important element in determining who's in your social network? Proximity, who's closest to you? Similarity, who's most like you? Attractiveness, including charisma? Social status? And diversity or dissimilarity? It's actually similarity. Similarity is number 1. We're very narcissistic. Attractiveness is number 2. We're kind of shallow. And proximity is the 3rd. We're also lazy. And so what you have is the high ranks of every traditionally male career still heavily male. And guess who's in their networks? And though people in their networks tend to get sponsorship. A sponsor is a mentor, but someone more, someone who's willing to invest his political capital to help you. That's what a sponsor is. And people sponsor people in their networks. Also, in-groups have informational advantages. So when there's tacit, important information, it tends to be shared through in-groups, and out-groups don't have the same kind of access to it. And then also, in-groups tend to get the benefit of the doubt as opposed to out-groups. That's also another element of the prove-it-again effect. So, so here's an example of what we do in the workbook. we have you analyze your social networks. Women's networks tend to be different than men's networks. And men's networks are actually perfectly designed to be very helpful to them in their careers. Women's networks, actually their default networks are less helpful to them in their careers. And so the first step is to analyze your network, and then to take concrete steps to help you build the kind of network that's going to be helpful throughout your career. Because the old saying, at least in the US, I don't know if you have it here, is it's not what you know, but who you know. It's half true. It's what you know too. So do study, please. But it is not just what you know. It is also who you know. And that's particularly challenging for people who are natural introverts, who get energy from being alone rather than with other people. And if you're like Bill Clinton, you know, you're glad-handing anyway. But if you're not, you have to be very mindful about how to construct a network that's going to be helpful. So let's look at how this prove-it-again effect plays out on the ground. Men tend to be judged on their potential, women on what they've already delivered, on their performance. And here's an example. This was a woman who was a rainmaker, basically a salesperson in a professional services firm. She said, I was constantly told, you have the network, but you don't have the work. Whereas a man could just take clients out for dinner or golfing. He was given credit for that. So you notice how he's being judged on his potential. Every year, she has to keep delivering. There's a study literally called, He's Skilled, She's Lucky. Successes tend to be attributed to unstable outside causes like luck, if they're of women in traditionally male fields. Whereas men's successes, I knew he was going to be great. He was such a great fit for that role. They tend to be attributed to skill. So of course, if your successes are discounted as luck, you have to have more of them. Mistakes, on the other hand, is the opposite is true. Women's mistakes tend to be noticed more and remembered longer. I knew she wasn't a good fit for that role. This just proves it. This is a Punch cartoon. That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Trigg. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. This is what my daughter and co-author Rachel christened the stolen idea. Again, it's a function of confirmation bias, the lack of fit, of who do you expect the brilliant idea to come from. That's the person whom you notice when they articulate it. And this is actually from the bingo, the gender bias bingo. This was a female science professor who needed an expensive piece of equipment, and she ordered it the same way that she'd seen everybody else do it. And she got roundly chewed out by the department secretary. Who do you think you are? You're a prima donna. You never follow the rules. And she said, wait a minute, I just saw 5 men do it just that way. That's an example of what's called leniency bias. Objective rules tend to be applied rigorously to outgroups, but leniently to in-groups. And you can't see it, but as I say each one of these things, people are nodding, which is what I noticed when I started to talk this way. If you describe bias at this concrete a level, people recognize it immediately. People often say, well, Sheryl Sandberg, you know, women are doing awesome. But what the studies show is that women superstars actually tend to get a little higher evaluations than male superstars. Who knew a woman could do it? It's called shifting standards. The prove-it-again effect impacts, though, everybody who's just merely excellent. And that's most of us. So pointing to a few superstars is evidence that women no longer have problem is just inconsistent with, you know, decades of studies. And then once you articulate these patterns so crisply in 4 patterns, you can begin to ask how these patterns differ by race. And they differ in super interesting ways. I'll just say a few words about it, happy to talk about it more. in the question and answer period. But the prove it again effect is much more likely to be reported by black women than it is by other women. 77% of black women, 2/3 of women in general report it. And that's because black women in the United States are triggering two sets of negative competence assumptions, one because they're women and the other because they're black. Black women are also more likely to attribute their prove it again problems to race. The other three groups of women, whites, Asian Americans, and Latinas, all attribute their prove it again problems by and large to gender. So that's a good example of how these patterns differ by race. The exploring how the experience of gender bias differs by race was really kind of the next step. And then the following step was exploring the differences between racial bias and gender bias. And for that, we have developed a simple 10-minute survey that will pick up every basic pattern of bias based on race, gender, and class origin in 10 minutes, as well as where those biases are playing out, whether it's in performance evaluations or whether it's in mentoring, et cetera, and then the impact of the bias on outcome measures, and I'll talk about that at the end of the talk. So that's the Workplace Experiences Survey. So you can see here that the nice little compact blue is white men. When I have to prove myself more than my colleagues of similar education and experience is the question. So 28% of white men say yes. 54% of white women say yes. 54% of men of color say yes. And 63% of women of color say yes. On Prove It Again, women of color are much more likely to report this Prove It Again. And all women are much more likely to report it than white men. Okay, so that's the first pattern. Now I'm going to tell you what to do about it as an individual. First of all, the individual bias interrupters. So picture it, you're sitting in a meeting and you see men being judged on their potential, women on their performance. What do? You can say really just mildly, I think we finally recognized what we're looking for in this position. We're looking for A, B, and C. So let's go back to the top of the pile and just make sure that we've picked up everybody, all the candidates who have those elements. That's a very powerful bias interrupter, and you can do it that way without spending a lot of political capital, because some people are going to that's bias. That works for you, that's great. Most of us have different ways to spend our political capital. So the focus, both in the individual interrupters and in the book, is to give strategies that don't require you to spend a lot of political capital. How about if you're sitting in a meeting and you see the stolen idea, which is is something, by the way, that happens by race as well as by gender. You can say, Tim, I've been thinking about that idea ever since Pam first said it. You've added something really intriguing. I wonder if Pam can take the next step, right? You can be very low-key, but the other thing, of course, is if you see this happening persistently, you have the meeting before the meeting. So when Tim repeats it, people can go like, "Oh, Tim, great riff on Pam's idea." And if you have more than one person doing this, actually, a friend of mine was on a board of a public company, and there were finally 3 women on the board, and they started doing this stolen idea thing, and the stolen idea disappeared within 2 meetings. Okay, now here's what women can do for themselves. First of all, don't do it to yourself. There was one study that found that if there were 9 requirements for promotion, women waited until they had 12. Whereas men go up with 6. Now, why do men go up with 6? Women are under a lot of gender pressures. So are men. Men are under pressures to show that they're competitive and ambitious, a real go-getter, and that takes them out of their comfort level. They're going to do it. because they have no alternative. Women have to do it too. You have to operate outside your comfort level in that way. Then if you think about it, if people are going to tend to notice and remember your mistakes and overlook or discount your successes, you've got to remind them. So it's important to keep careful real-time records of all objective metrics met, which means you have to figure out what the objective metrics are in your environment, and that's the kind of thing the workbook is designed to help you with. And then you need to spend the time to show that you've met the metrics. And, you know, this is good advice for anyone, but it's much more optional for men than it is for women. For women, you really should be doing this. And then, what if you get a compliment? You should arm your mentors, sponsors, and allies with those objective metrics and with compliments. And you can say, you know, would it be helpful to someone who's shown an interest in your career if I pass along, you know, nice things people say about me? And if they say yes, you can say, oh, well, that's fabulous. Thank you so much. What's the best way for me to communicate with you? You know, would you prefer an email, or should I just tell you in the hall? That way you've asked permission, but you're also arming your network so that there also will be cueing people with what you have, with your accomplishments. And here's an example of the kind of thing that an organization can do at an organizational level. If you're running a hiring process, you can, at the beginning of the process, pre-commit to what's important and what you're going to look for in candidates. And then it's equally important, if there's a candidate that is so brilliant that you're going to waive one of the requirements, you have to do so formally and explain why it's no longer important. I can't tell you the number of times in academic hiring, and I've been a professor for almost 40 years, where women and people of color are dinged out of the pool because they don't meet an objective criterion, and then all of a sudden a brilliant person of a certain demographic comes along, and you never hear that criterion mentioned again, which basically means for women and people of color, you have a formal national search, and for the brilliant young white guy, you have a search of one. I've seen that so many times, and this is an example of how to interrupt that process if you're running a hiring process. Okay, the second pattern of bias you see is the most common one. I call it the tightrope, and 3/4 of women report it. This is important because before we wrote What Works for Women at Work, very few people were talking about this. Most people were talking through the implicit association test, an online test, about the first pattern, the prove it again pattern, the cognitive bias. The tightrope stems from prescriptive stereotypes. Women are expected to be nice and communal, helpful, modest, interpersonally sensitive, good team players. That's a good woman. How about a man to be reckoned with? Really different. Men are expected to be competent and what the social psychologists call agentic, assertive, direct, competitive, ambitious, leaders. Those prescriptive stereotypes have not changed much in the past 40 years since they were first outlined. And they have very profound effects in today's workplace. So, for example, studies show that displays of confidence, directness, and authority actually decrease women's influence at the same time as they increase men's influence. What's the matter with her? She's defectively modest, self-effacing, and nice. She's not a good person. Tentative language and a warm cooperative style increases women's influence, but that leads to things like women saying, instead of saying, we should do this, they go, I wonder if anybody might have thought about this. And then Tim's goes, yeah, I totally thought about it. That's a great idea. People go, let's go with Tim's idea. And so you can see how the tightrope and the prove it again bias combine to rob women of attribution for their ideas very often. Also, men interrupt more, they participate more, and they get more encouragement for doing so. This is a study out of economics. When it comes to teamwork, one study found that co-authored articles in economics help men, but they hurt women, because the assumption is the woman is just the helper. And so again, you see the men feeling that gender pressure to be competitive, ambitious, and jumping right in there. But if a woman does the same, then she's often not met with the same reaction. And so women find themselves walking a really narrow tightrope. If they are seen as too feminine, then they are definitely liked, but not respected. But if they're seen as too masculine, then they're definitely respected, but not liked. I call it that the Hilary problem. That's part of what happened to Hilary in the campaign. Trump's likability was higher than Clinton's, but it didn't matter. If you're not a good man, you can still be a real man. But if you're not a good woman, you're a worthless person. And that explained partly what happened in the election. That's the gender element. So this tightrope translates into two different sets of pressures. One is pressure on women to behave in feminine ways and play feminine roles, even in the workplace. So, for example, to be the peacemaker, or the office mom, or the dutiful daughter who aligns with a powerful man but never, ever challenges him. Also, Rachel coined this term, doing the office housework, which now is quite well known. The office housework is really for quite different kinds of things, but women are seen as having a taste and talent for all four. Some of it's literal housework, planning parties, arranging lunch. Some of it's administrative work, getting people on a conference call, finding a room, taking notes. Some of it is emotion work. He's upset. Can you fix it? And then some of it is important work, but it's kind of undervalued behind the scenes work, as opposed to the upfront glamour work, which men are seen as having a particular taste and talent for. And after all, he has his dignity. You couldn't deprive him of his dignity. That makes you a bad person. So there's that level of entitlement as well. So as you can see, this is not a racial pattern. It is purely a gender pattern. If you say, I do more housework like planning parties than my colleagues, 19% of white men say yes, 36% of white women, 15%, actually 16% of men of color, and 31% of women of color. On these two feminine issues, white women and Asian American women are often come out measuring most high. So it's a different racial variation pattern that exists for Prove It Again. On the other hand, if women are direct, outspoken, assertive, and competitive, this might be what happens. So if you're stern or you say no, one woman told me, the immediate reaction is to call that woman a bitch, right? If you're a man, it's just a no. Women who give developmental feedback on performance evaluations tend to be disliked. The same pattern. Also, showing anger actually tends to increase the perceived status of a man, but decrease the perceived status of a woman. So much so that of the 127 very successful, savvy women who I interviewed, only 3 had ever expressed anger on the job, ever. It's very, very risky for women. And it's, even in environments where the organizational norm is not to be a screamer, that typically means that most men aren't screamers and none of the women are, but there are a few screamers and they're almost always men. They're almost always white men, because this is also a very strong racial pattern. Being an angry black person, at least in the United States, is like not a good career move. Self-promotion also differs by gender. open self-promotion tends to work for men, but not for women. Again, you're being defectively modest, self-effacing, and nice. You're violating the prescriptive stereotype. And this is a quote, actually. We run a leadership academy in San Francisco for law firm partners. And so a woman law firm partner who was at the academy had found that she was making about $200,000 a year less than a man. And she knew that his metrics were very similar. And so she went to a member of the compensation committee, which was the established procedure. She did exactly what we would recommend. She said, I want to familiarize you. I brought in this client, which was worth X, and I grew this client from Y to Z. And the guy on the comp committee looked at her and said, well, you think highly of yourself, don't you? So push back for self-promotion. Okay, so how do you navigate the tightrope? First of all, if you hear somebody saying, she's not a team player, she has sharp elbows, what a witch, she really flew off the handle, she's a real self-promoter, you can just say, really, in a low-key way, do you think we would be saying this if she were a man? When it comes to office housework, here's what you can do to help other people. First of all, don't handle it through volunteers. Because if you do, women will be under strong informal pressures to volunteer, and men actually will be under strong informal pressures not to volunteer. We once did a study of a company's performance evaluations, and the women were doing wild amounts of office housework and praised to the skies for it, though of course it never helped them advance. One man had volunteered for it, and he was faulted for not understanding what was valued in the organization. That's what will happen if you assign this work through volunteers. So set up a rotation. And if you see a woman volunteering again and again and taking on a lot of this office housework, take her aside and say, you know, we really appreciate the fact that you're such a good team player here, but what's really going to matter when it comes from promotion are X, Y, and Z. So let's try to transition you into some of those roles. And if she says, but I love planning the parties, you can say to her, you know, God bless. You know, if you love planning the parties, maybe you should continue, but then you're kind of at a fork in the road. That's actually not going to help you get tenure or, you know, get promoted. So if you care about that, then perhaps, and you love planning parties, you know, do you want to plan the parties and also do all these other things? Or do you prefer just to plan the parties? And you can say that without being judgmental, but you can teach her how to do what we call the strategic no. If she has this constant stream of requests to do this stuff, to go out and figure out what are a couple of those things that could actually help her career, like putting her in touch maybe with somebody much higher up in her field, and then go out and do those. And then the next time the paperclips committee comes up, she can just say, I would love to be on paperclips for the 5th year in a row, but I'm actually working with Tim on getting this major grant. That's the strategic no. When it comes to strategies individual women can use, this is a touchy subject because you're basically telling women how to be feminine or masculine. And so, you know, if what you're doing is working for you, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if people aren't taking you seriously, if you're getting large loads of office housework, or if you're getting pushback that you're a bit too much, here are some of the things that might work. First of all, what do you do when you can't get a word in edgewise? This is actually something that an investment banker's mentor told her. He said, wait until someone is almost finished with his point and he's kind of powering down, and then you jump in and start to make your point. And if he doesn't stop, you go, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were done, right? That's what I call gender judo. And gender judo is if you're going to do a masculine thing, but you're worried about the pushback, you do it in a feminine way. Now, Should we have to do this? Totally not. Every single truly highly placed women I interviewed did it. Every single one. Here's an example. This was somebody who was one of the only CEOs, a very early woman CEO in Silicon Valley, at a time when she was virtually the only woman CEO in the Valley. Still is, by the way. She said, here's what I do. She said, I'm warm Ms. Mother 95% of the time, so that the 5% of the time when I need to be tough, I can be. And you notice how she's embracing a feminine stereotype, the office mom. But that typically holds women back, but she's flipping it around to propel herself forward. That's the judo move. Now, if this revolts you, totally don't do it. It doesn't revolt me. I came up very masculine. First of all, I think all of us of our generation, we felt comfortable with masculinity, or we would have been housewives. We had to be. We were the only women in sight. I have gotten much more femmy as my daughter Rachel started me wearing little dresses and stuff. She's long since gone to pants, but I'm stuck. I still like large trucks and dresses. But I think of femininity and masculinity kind of as a toolbox. And there's some kinds of femininity I wouldn't be caught dead wearing, like deference. Not my thing. But there are other parts of femininity I kind of like. I have kind of an affection for. And so if you're interested in gender judo, think of elements of femininity that you have that reaction to, not the ones that you would actually literally rather die than do. No job is worth that. If you look at the literature on negotiation, gender and negotiation, you probably heard women don't negotiate. You probably didn't hear the study that showed why women don't negotiate. Women who do negotiate tend to be disliked and are less likely to be hired. That's the tightrope, right? A penalty for masculine behavior. So what is a girl to do? Well, if you look at the literature, the recommendations are to make the request communal. It's important for my team. To express concern for relationships. I'm concerned about how this might be perceived by X, and blame it on someone else. My mentor told me it was really important for me to negotiate. All of that's basically gender judo, right? You're doing a masculine thing negotiating, so you're doing it in this femme sort of way. But that's what the gender and negotiation literature says works for women at work. Now, you may want to try and just kind of do what the guys do, like I have a competing offer, and see if that works before you go the gender judo route. But keep in mind, a man saying, I have a competing offer, well, he's supposed to be direct, competitive, and ambitious. He's completely fulfilling his sex role. You are being modest, defectively modest, self-effacing, and nice, not a good team player. That's the gender judo element. When it comes to self-promotion, the single best strategy is what I call forming a posse. That's of people who are about at your level or one notch above and celebrating each other's successes. Now, this should be a posse of not only other women, but including men. So that you're celebrating other people's successes, but meanwhile, they're celebrating yours. Also, good way to be a good person too, right? And then if you're a leader, also praise your team. Now make it clear you led the team, but you can praise your team, and that's socially appropriate for women. There is literally a formula in one of the studies about how to get angry as a woman. If I look angry, it's because I am angry. And the reason I'm angry is that you've jeopardized, and then insert shared business goal here. In other words, I'm not a raging id. You know, I am a businesswoman, and you have made a mistake, and we disagree. So that's the formula for getting angry. And then what we have in bias interrupters is tools for interrupting bias in assignments and performance evaluations. And here's one example. These are all free, open source. You can just print them out and and co-brand them, and use them in your environment. But one study of performance evaluations in tech found that 66% of women were faulted for personality problems, but only 1% of men. So if you are not using these bias interrupters, you are probably constantly passing through this kind of tightrope bias in your performance evaluations. Here's the third pattern. We call it the maternal wall. And you can see it's less common. 59% of the mothers who I interviewed reported it. Subsequent data, though, suggests that it's more like 80%, these national surveys that we've done. When triggered, it's an order of magnitude stronger than anything I've talked about up to now. This was my friend Shelley's study. She gave people identical resumes, one but not the other a mother. The only difference was that one mentioned membership in the Parent Teachers Association. That was enough to produce this amazing effect, so that 79%, the mothers were 79% less likely to be hired, half as likely to be promoted, offered an average of $11,000 in salary. These were identical resumes, mind you, and held to higher performance and punctuality standards. So if women don't seem to fit these high-level, traditionally male roles, mothers seem to fit much worse. This is prove it again squared. Fathers, actually, in the same study, were held to lower performance and punctuality standards. He has a family to support. I don't need to look over his shoulder, right? On the other hand, God forbid that a father actually take an active role. Men and women value flex equally, but men are less likely to use workplace flexibility if they think they will be seen as less masculine, and they are if they use it. Even men who take parental leave encounter what we call the flexibility stigma. They are seen as more uncertain, less commanding, and that study showed that the flexibility stigma is actually totally accounted for by the femininity stigma. Men who take parental leave or flexible work policies are basically stigmatized as gender deviants. That actually makes it gender discrimination, litigable gender discrimination in the U.S. On the other hand, mothers who are indisputably competent and indisputably committed, they're seen as less likable, and they're held to higher performance standards. She's a bad mother, so she's a bad person. We got to keep an eye on that one. And so you might think, well, the obvious answer is not to have children. This is a quote of a U.S. senator when Janet Napolitano became the first Secretary for Homeland Security in the U.S. He said, Janet's perfect for that job, because for that job you have to have no life. Janet has no family. Perfect. She can devote like 19, 20 hours a day to it. What that is basically a modern version of the pathetic spinster stereotype. Now the fault is the defective gender performance is not failing to get married. The defective gender performance is failing to have children. And so you're seen as somehow lacking as a person. And in fact, there's a study out of the UK that found that single women without children work the longest hours of any group in the entire economy. That's because everything gets dumped on them because they clearly have no life. Okay, here are some strategies. People say, remember that time she wasn't here? And she's not here again. I remember this was a woman scientist study again. And one of these women scientists said, I wasn't here for a team meeting like 2 years ago. That's because my child had an emergency. And that was the only team meeting I ever missed. And people still cite it to me all the time, even though I'd never missed another team meeting. So you can say, yeah, I totally remember when she wasn't here 2 years ago. I also remember that she's been here every other time. You probably should too. how about if somebody returns from maternity leave and you have an opportunity that really would be an important professional step for her? The opportunity, for example, to apply for a grant or a promotion. But you don't know if it's going to be too much. She seems overwhelmed. You invite her into your office and you say, you know, I have an opportunity for you that would really be the next step in your career, and you were totally ready for this, you would completely smash it. If, though, it's not a good time for you, don't worry about it. These things come up from time to time, and they make sure they do. And this is something you should be doing also for men who have just had a baby, because there's now a real generational conflict between men, such that there's been a real shift between my generation and younger generations in men's vision of what it means to be a good father. And so younger men often feel that being a good father means actually being there, being involved in the daily care of children, rather than showing up to performances, which is kind of a good fatherland in my generation. And so you have these generational conflicts among men, where the older men are often trying to police the younger men into being a truly responsible father who is doing the best for his family by being a breadwinner. Here's an example from the Bias Interrupters website. It's very important to use metrics to measure your progress. And this is, I mean, it's so lame to have to say this, but you know, when businesses focus on any problem that they actually care about, they develop a metric, and then they keep trying things until they nail the metric. That's what they do. They don't say, oh my God, we have a terrible problem for women, let's set aside 20,000 pounds for a women's initiative. That's just not, it's a good thing. It's completely non-responsive. So one of the things that the Bias Interrupters website has is for hiring, performance evaluations, assignments. Here you see the metrics when it comes to performance evaluations. Do women's evaluations fall after they have children? Do employees' ratings fall after they take parental leave or adopt flexible work arrangements? How about for women themselves? The important message for women themselves is to know this maternal wall bias exists. So when you return from maternity leave, if you still are very focused on your career, say so. The best thing actually is when you return from maternity leave is to go to your supervisor or the equivalent in academia and say, I'm so delighted to be back. I want to talk through my career goals for the next 2 years and 5 years. What you're doing there is countering the bias with what's called individuating information. You know, mothers in general, we both agree, are probably losers, but not me. I'm different. If you're willing to travel, stay so. If you're the primary earner, say so, because if you don't, people will make all the opposite assumptions. If your partner is willing to follow you, very important in academia, at least in the United States, say so. What if somebody says something to you, and this is a direct quote actually from an Asian American lawyer, she said, my partners say to me all the time stuff like this, my wife could never leave the kids that much. She could never, my wife could never work the kind of hours you work. You just smile sweetly and say, you know, Tolstoy was wrong. Happy families are not all alike. I'm sure that's right for you and your family, but this is what's right for me and my family. Or you could say, that's unbelievably sexist, whichever works better. This is the final pattern. We call it the tug of war among women. As you can see, it's the least common pattern. Only 55% of my informants reported it. That it's when gender bias against women fuels conflicts among women. And we just saw it in the Me Too context, where that letter that Catherine Deneuve and other French other French women signed saying that Me Too had gone very far. Women can make sure that her wages are equal to a man's, but not feel forever traumatized by a man who rubs himself up against her in a subway. She said there's just expressing sexual yearning. And I would respond, yes, in a way that's sexual harassment. But the interesting thing, and there's of course a huge furor in France over this, what that shows is that women my age, and Catherine Deneuve and I are almost exactly the same age. I mean, when we came up, the boys' club was the only way, it was the only deal on offer. We had to fit in, or we would soon be homemakers because we would lose our jobs. And so if you've always had to be a member of the boys' club, sometimes some women respond by kind of policing other women into being members of the boys' club. That's a good example of the tug of war among women. Now, one thing to recognize is it doesn't always happen. 3/4 of the women science professors I interviewed said things like this: the older women are always very encouraging, very helpful, and very kind to me. So the tug of war among women does not always occur. Here's where the problems arise. Opportunities for women here are very zero-sum, one woman told me. If one woman gets a prized position, another woman won't. And so it breeds a sense of competition. This is often called the problem of the queen bee, as if this were yet another woman with yet another personality problem. But this is not a personality problem. This is just an ambitious woman navigating an environment deeply shaped by gender bias. This is I call it strategic distancing. This is Marissa Mayer, until recently the only current CEO in Silicon Valley, Sheryl Sandberg's the COO. And when she was at Google, she said, "I'm not a girl at Google, I'm a geek at Google." And you notice how adeptly she distances herself from the out-group girls and aligns herself with the in-group geeks. I'm a member of the boys' club. And there's studies out of the Netherlands that show that women who start out without much of a gender perspective and encounter a lot of gender discrimination often respond through strategic distancing. And then all three of the other patterns of bias can also be passed through from women to women. Here's an example of the prove it again pass through. Because she struggled a lot and had to work extra hard, so she expects other women to have done as much as she has. The goal is to have women achieve high standards, so there's no criticism. This is basically an older woman making younger women prove it again, because she kind of thinks that's real life. May not be fair, but that's real life. Here, one of the things that's been rarely noted but comes up in our studies is that women, professional women, often get less administrative support than professional men do. And this is a female secretary in the United States talking about women lawyers. She said female lawyers are harder on their female assistants, more detail-oriented, and they have to try harder to prove themselves, so they put that on you. That's a pass-through, prove it again, right? The woman lawyer knows she's going to be held to higher standards, so she's very demanding of the secretary, so the secretary kind of hates her guts. In this study, not one secretary preferred to work with women partners. Now, 50% didn't care, men or women, but everyone who had a preference preferred to work with men. The other reason this happens is that the admins look up and see who flies up to the majors, as we say in baseball, who makes it big, and it's almost all men, so they would prefer to hitch their star. Just makes sense. Again, this isn't bitchy, it's just ambitious. Here's the tightrope pass-through. The younger women just don't get what it takes to be successful. The older women sniff. To which the younger women snap, "We don't want your sorry-ass lives. You just turned into men," right? That's like, you're too feminine, you're too masculine, and it's often generational. And then here's the maternal wall pass-through. it's often women my age faulting younger women for taking a long parental leave or going part-time, saying, I worked full-time my whole careers and my kids are fine, right? And you notice what's driving that. It's really identity threat. Like, are you calling me a bad mother? No, I'm just trying to take parental leave to which I am legally entitled. But the older woman's identity is threatened. Basically, if we define the ideal worker as someone who's always available to their employer, and the ideal mother as someone who's always available to their children, well, that's impossible. And so every woman feels kind of inadequate. And if they end up fighting with each other because of that, that's the mommy wars. And then sometimes women who are child-free, who never want children, say, these mothers are always asking for special treatment or just reinforcing stereotypes. Or women who were childless, who wanted children but never had children because of the inexorable clockwork of male careers, say, I had to make hard choices. Why should she have it all? So those are the mommy wars. So the tug of war is difficult to challenge on your own. But one of the most powerful things that younger women can do if they find these dynamics, first of all, recognize this is a symptom of gender bias in your environment. You know, do you want to be in that environment? Worth asking that question. Also, to go to older women and say, you know, I'm really grateful for everything you did. What was it like when you first were here? Because you know what it was like, young ladies? It was really crappy. It was really bad. We fought those battles. We fought them for you. And so actually just stepping outside of yourself and expressing some interest and some gratitude can often help to defuse these conflicts. You also might learn a thing or two that you were really surprised about. In terms of the individual interrupters, it's important if you're a manager to find out whether women in your environment are getting the same level of administrative support that men are, because often they aren't, and nobody has ever really asked. And if there are conflicts among women, as I said, the first thing to do is ask yourself, do some women have personality problems? Yeah, women are people. Some people have personality problems. And so it may just be someone who has a personality problem, but ask yourself if it's really a symptom of gender bias in the environment is the first step. And it's important to recognize the limits of sisterhood. You know, when men act uncollegial and ambitious, we call them ambitious. When women act the same way, what do we call them, right? That's just a pass-through of gender bias. You know, we don't expect men always to support other men. It's unrealistic to expect women to always support other women. And I personally have, you know, put a lot of effort, as you can tell, in trying to support other women. But my attitude is, you know, if this isn't your shtick, I understand that. It's not as if men have to take on addressing a major vector of social inequality at the same time that they are navigating their careers. I think this should be optional for women as well. On the other hand, undercutting other women is not a good career move. It is that will blow up in your face. So I think it's important to make that distinction. If you see someone constantly undercutting you, it's really important to put a stop to it and to make an enemy into an ally. And there's actually, I was talking to the general counsel, the top lawyer of one of the largest corporations in America, and she was talking to me about an incident, and I describe it in the book, where another woman was just constantly undercutting her. And she called the other woman in her office, and she said, you know, I perceive, and I may not be correct in this, that you don't always view me in the best light. And I would really like to talk that through with you, because it's my intention to support you, and I hope you feel the same way. And she never had heard another peep from that person. it's really important not to let this go unaddressed. I did for 25 years. Didn't work. And then senior women, it's really important to understand that younger women, their experiences are simply different than ours were. You know, I think of this in terms of, you know, the curve. When I came up, the only women who entered these careers were on the long tail. Now, because of what we accomplished, a much healthier part of the distribution of women is entering these careers, which simply means that a lot of the younger women, they just aren't like us. That's the success. On the other hand, younger women need to recognize that sometimes senior women aren't helping you as much as you think we should, because we don't have the power that you think we do. Because one of the things that I found most shocking, I assumed I chose really highly successful women to talk to because I wanted their political savvy as to how they navigated through gender bias. And they were still navigating these patterns throughout their entire career. In fact, some of them actually get worse as you get more senior at the same time that others attenuate. And then get women working together with other women and not just on women's issues, because the strategic distancers will not work on women's issues. They do not want to be associated with women. So what we see from the Workplace Experiences Survey is that there are robust levels of racial and gender bias. In today's, we've done it with lawyers and engineers. We've just folded a study of engineers in India. We are probably about to, we hope to be giving it to architects in the United States. So robust levels of both racial and gender bias, and that they correlate negatively with people's sense of belonging and actually their intent to stay as well. Then there are also robust levels of both kinds of bias. If you ask questions like, I have had good mentors. Remember, white men are in the blue, and then it goes down from there. Or my pay is comparable to that of my colleagues with similar qualifications and experience. 2/3 of white men say yes. Only about 1/3 of women of color say yes. And so what we need to do is not only to learn how to navigate these patterns, which unfortunately, we tried, ladies, we really tried, but they're still out there. So to learn how to navigate these patterns for yourself, but also to urge organizations to take an approach to interrupting these patterns of bias that is evidence-based and metrics-driven, and that's the Harvard Law Review Business Review article in which I articulate the bias interrupters approach. And we look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.